Okay, I think it's about the top of the hour here, so we shall get started. So for those, again, that are just joining in, we are using Me Too throughout this session, our webinar on employee engagement and the rising use of tech. And we've got a guest speaker, Emma Bridger from People Lab today, and Emma's going to be asking you a few polls, as well as doing some Q&A at the end of the session. So please follow those instructions on the screen to access Me Too, either via the native apps on iOS or Android, or go to our web app at web.metoo.com and enter the meeting ID for this session, which is 195-791-682. Now, while you all get connected to that session, I just want to do a bit of an introduction here. So, as I've said, we're really lucky today to have an expert host for the webinar in Emma, who's the founder and MD of People Lab. Now, Emma's going to introduce herself and People Lab fully in a moment, but I just wanted to make sure that I thanked Emma for presenting today and to say how exciting this subject of technology in employee engagement is, and how proud we at Me Too are to be part of the engagement tech mix in so many market-leading organisations. Now, Me Too differs from, but is complementary to, much of the other tech that's being used in employee engagement and internal comms, as it doesn't require any logins or personal details. So it really removes that risk of judgment by peers or bosses. And the feedback that we hear is that employees really take to Me Too as it gives them a channel to share honest and uninhibited feedback in that comms meeting environment. So as you can imagine, we're really pleased to be teaming up with thought leaders like People Lab, who can share their experience and insights. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Emma to kickstart the session.
Thank you, thanks. Really delighted to be here today to talk about employee engagement and tech. And without me sounding like a complete geek, I agree, it is exciting. It is quite a brave new world, and there's, every day there's so much going on, so much happening, and lots of opportunities to really use these new technologies to help engage employees. So I won't go on about People Lab too much, just a couple of sort of, well, not even that, a minute maybe, just for those of you that haven't heard of us. We are one of the UK's leading employee engagement consultancies. We believe that work doesn't need to be a miserable experience, so we work with employers all over the world to help create great places to work. And that's all I'm going to say. That's it. I'm going to get straight onto the slides and straight on to talking about this kind of brave new world of engagement and tech. But before I do, our first poll, I'm really interested to find out if your organisation is using any kind of app for employee engagement. So using the Me Too app, if you could answer that question, that would be great. I think, as I said, the world's moving really, really quickly when it comes to tech and engagement. And the research I'm going to talk to you about, which is looking actually at enterprise social networks and engagement, was done probably about 18 months ago now. And even in those 18 months, we've seen a huge change in companies embracing technology to help them get it right with their people and create great places to work. So just interested to find out if you're using them or not. So have we got the results yet? Okay, so interesting. I was going to crouch down to have a look because I've got very light in here. Okay, so kind of about 3/4 yes and 1/4 no. And good to see that I haven't got anyone that said I'm not sure. So that's good news. So yeah, I mean, I think even a year ago we would have had quite a different result on that. So it's really exploded. The technology space when it comes to engagement has really exploded, and it can actually feel quite overwhelming, I think, for companies who have a hunch that technology can really help them to get it right with their people in a whole different, different ways. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But great to see that you guys are using them. So if we go back to the slides, then if that's okay. So I'm just going to mention something called the Employee Engagement App to start with. So this is something that we've been talking about in People Lab that really, I think you'll probably be familiar with this ever increasing interest on engagement, in engagements. People talk about it, it's at the top of the management agenda. There's a couple of stats down here. 50% of the the HR elite spend 50% of their time every week on engagement. If that's true or not, but one study says it is. Deloitte's continually say that engagement is kind of one of the sort of top priorities of organizations around the world. That's actually from the 2015 Deloitte's Global Capital Trends, Human Capital Trends report, rather than the 2017, because they've kind of changed it slightly to employee experience. But anyway, we know that people are focusing on engagement. So why is it that we're not very good at it? You look at kind of any study from around the world, and it kind of ranges from pretty poor to absolutely abysmal. So again, taking the stats here in the middle from the CIPD, again, it's from 2015 because they measure this slightly differently now. But 2015, you know, 39% engaged in the UK. If you look at Gallup, it's a lot less. If you look at Deloitte, it's a lot less. So, you know, we've got all this focus on engagement, but we're not very good at it. And we want to find out why that is. And specifically what we're talking about today, you know, why is it? And can technology help us? So can we use technology to try to close this employee engagement gap? So if we just move on to the next slide, we do lots of research at People Lab. We are real nerds when it comes to engagement and finding out what's going on in the outside world and talking to lots of organisations. And we've done a couple of pieces of research over the last few years. We do our Spotlight on Employee Engagement research, which kind of just looks at the sort of general state of the nation when it comes to engagement. And we've also done a specific piece on enterprise social networks. And this is one of the findings from our research. So just 9% of people we spoke to were using an app for engagement, although this is about 12 months old. So as I say, the world's moving really, really quickly. And we said, well, if you're not using one, what do you think about it? You know, and you can see the kind of sort of responses there range from, yeah, I really want one, they're amazing, to, yeah, okay, got potential, to don't know much about them, what is an app, through to still undecided. So I think that at that point the jury is still out, and I think even 12 months later we will get very, very different results if we were to ask this question again, which we will be this year. So keep your eyes peeled for our research, which will be going out later on this year. So moving on to the next slide then. Asking about annual staff surveys, and you might think, well, what's staff surveys got to do with tech? But what we've seen is that, thank goodness, the really sort of standard do a massive set piece survey and then do nothing with the results, which is often the way in organisations. It's in decline, and what we've seen is that a lot of the early movers, the sort of the early adopters when it comes to tech, are saying, you know what, we don't want to do a really big set piece survey anymore that costs us a fortune. We're going to use some of the new technology out there, be it apps, be it enterprise social networks, to help us to really keep our finger on the pulse of organisations and find out how people are feeling. So we're not going to go out once a year, we're going to have a kind of continuous, always on listening strategy, and we're going to use technology and apps to help us do that. So we're starting to see that this sort of annual staff surveys in decline, and more people are using tech to run regular pulse surveys, or even kind of, you know, even weekly or always on kind of type of measurement systems where they're not waiting once a year to find out how their people are feeling. So I think there's a massive opportunity there for technology to influence that engagement gap score that we saw earlier. So moving on to the next slide, the other area that I think there's a huge potential for technology to help us with when it comes to engagement is around this idea of the enablers of engagement. So for those of you that haven't seen these before, these were first coined by the Engagement Success Movement almost 10 years ago now, and we've added a fifth one, which is involvement. And they said companies that get it right when it comes to engagement tend to focus on these areas: line managers, employee voice, strategic narrative, involvement, integrity. And what we believe, the hypothesis that we have that we're testing with our research is that apps, tech generally can really help with some of this. So it can massively help with employee voice. So what better way to give employees a voice than to have some kind of app? And, you know, your experience at the moment with the Me Too app, that's something that can really help employees to make their voice heard, to respond to questions, to give feedback, and lots of different ways you can do that. Also, these technologies can really help with involvement. They can, you know, connect people from around the organisation. They can help collaboration, etc., etc. So there's a huge potential for technology to really help to companies to focus on these enablers and to get really good at things like employee voice. We've got, you know, remote workforce around the world. How do you kind of give them a voice? Well, you know, these technologies are making it a lot easier for us. There's a couple of areas to think about there. So just moving on then, what I would like to do is to ask you, before I go into the results that we got from the research that we did, to ask you if you think that tech at work, be it apps, be it enterprise social networks, intranets, can tech positively impact engagement? So if you could answer by the app, yes, no, not sure, that would be great. And while you're doing that, I have a quick sip of my lovely tea that I've got here.
Hi Emma, and just while we're waiting for these responses to come in, there's somebody asked quite a useful question here. Is they've asked if you'd be able to define engagement so all on the call are on the same page. So I just think that just while we're waiting for that.
It's a great question. I haven't got a copy of my book here. I won't run and get a copy of my book. So I've actually written a book on engagement, and the second edition is about to be out in August this year, published by Kogan Page, plug. And of course, the first chapter of the book is what's engagement, and it's a really difficult question to answer. On researching this question, there are 50+ definitions out there and counting. They're very academic definitions, they're very practitioner-based definitions. Of course, I have a definition. The definition that I use is the extent to which people are personally involved in the success of a business. That's the definition that I use. Being a kind of a glass half full kind of a person, I think this gives companies a great opportunity to actually have a conversation about, we're focusing on engagement, what's it really mean to us, how are we going to define it? Because of course, if you haven't defined it, how on earth can you measure it? How do you know what your engagement levels are? So you can Google employee engagement definitions, and you'll get hundreds probably now. You can in fact, we do a free download of my first chapter, so if you want to download that, I can let you have a link afterwards. Have a look at that. But I think it's a great opportunity to sort of have a chat in your organisation about what's it really mean to us, and how will we define it, and therefore how will we measure it? So it's a great question, and I'm sorry I can't be more specific with the answer. Psychologists actually talk, I'm a psychologist by trade, that's my background. They talk about work engagements. They have a slightly different definition, but practitioners talk about employee engagement. Right, okay, so most of you think yes, nobody thinks no, and some are not sure, so the jury's still out. Okay, so I think that's a really good response. So moving on from there then, I'm going to talk to you about a piece of research that we did about 18 months ago. So as I said, I'm a psychologist by trade, so I get really nerdy about all this stuff, and I'm fascinated about this kind of brave new world of some of these technologies and saying, actually, can they help make us happier at work? And we focused in on enterprise social networks specifically. So for those of you thinking, what's an ESN? Essentially, the way I explain it is it's social media inside the firewall of an organisation. So it might be Workplace by Facebook, it might be Yammer, Jive, it might be a bespoke app that you've built, but it's basically kind of some sort of social network that is within inside the confines of the enterprise. And when we did the research, we did kind of define it for people so they knew what the hell we were talking about, which is always a good place to start. It was very much a proper academic piece of research, so we used kind of proper sort of psychological scales in here. It wasn't just let's bug a few questions in SurveyMonkey and see what happens. I did actually do this as part of a master's in applied positive psychology that I was doing at the time, so it was kind of a proper robust piece of research. So moving on, let's see what the research is all about. So we wanted to find out who was using ESNs and why and how are they using them, and what the impacts were on engagement and well-being. Just quickly want to point out to this definition piece, slightly confusing. So I've already said that engagement, psychologists talk about work engagement, and we use the scale from Schofeli and Baker, who developed the scale of work engagement. So we use their proper sort of psychological tested scale. But well-being can be slightly confusing term. So psychologists, when they talk about well-being, they mean what the layperson would call happiness. But obviously in business, when people talk about well-being, they often mean health and well-being. But we're talking about psychological well-being, which, to you and I, we would mean happiness, essentially. So that's what we meant by that. So moving on to the next slide, who took part? So it wasn't the hugest piece of research, but given that I think this was the first of its kind that I could find, a big literature review, because it's part of a master's I was doing at the time, so big lit review. I couldn't find any other research at the time that looked at this, so it's very exciting. And there is more now out there now, but at the time there was nothing. So we had 106 organisations take part, so it wasn't insignificant, from all over the world, large, small, etc. So if you want a copy of the research in full, we can obviously give you access afterwards. So then what did the results tell us? So moving on to the next slide, I picked out a few kind of interesting I suppose snippets of information, because it was a really big piece of research. So the first thing we looked at was kind of channels and accessibility. So if we just move on to, it's probably, yeah, this slide here. What was really interesting is that email, I don't know if you can see that, but email still dominates. So for the people we spoke to, the companies we spoke to, email is still king. Most people are still using email, and it's really interesting. I've been working in this field for about 20 years now, and I'd say for the last 10 years, the end of email has been predicted, but we haven't quite got there yet. Even with all these amazing new technologies, we're still using email or types of email to communicate, and there's no getting away from it that email is not an engaging tool to use. You don't think, oh, I feel really great about working here because I get lots of emails. And right down the bottom of that, I won't go through all of them, right down the bottom of that, you'll see the kind of app is at the other end of the scale. I think this would have changed by now. We will probably be doing some more research on this, maybe early part of next year. So moving on, this was really interesting. How do people access information? So despite the fact the majority of people still are saying kind of a desktop or a laptop in the office, we're seeing kind of remote working from home a lot more prevalent than I thought we would. So you can have a look at that chart there and have a look at those results. So, personal mobile devices, I was quite surprised by that 20%. I thought it'd be less than that. So we're starting to see people accessing information in a range of ways. And again, even a couple of years ago, I think we would have seen a much bigger result from the kind of desktop, laptop in the office. So moving on, what the next slide shows us actually is that ESN use was significant. I was surprised by this. So 45, so almost half of the organisations that took part in the study had some sort of ESN. So I was really surprised by that. I thought it'd be a lot less. But of those that have it, 93% are using it regularly, and 74% access it every day. Now, there is, obviously getting into psychological terms here, there is a kind of a bit of a bias here, because the kind of people that got involved with the study are the kind of people that probably are more au fait with these sorts of technologies. So it was a first study, it was a preliminary study, just to kind of give a little bit of a what's really going on out there. But this was a lot higher than I expected it to be. So moving on to the next slide. What we asked was how do you use it, or even what do you use it for? And without doubt, the biggest finding was all about collaboration, which I thought was really interesting. And there's a few others down there that you might want to delve into a little bit. So collaboration was kind of the top reason for use. 68% was about locating expertise. So that might have been, an actual document or other people to help them with the project. 56% was about making their voice heard. So, links back to that employee voice enabler engagement. 53% said to take part in an online community, and 50% said to interact with like-minded people. There's a lot more, by the way, a whole load of stuff that sits underneath this, but I'm just kind of giving you the highlights. So really interesting to see how people are using these new technologies and what are they using them for. So using them in a very different way for things like email and intranets, which are much more passive and one way. This is showing already it's much more of a kind of a two-way communication tool. So moving on to the next slide, we asked the people that took part in the survey how they would rate their experience, and again, really, really positive results, which I was very pleasantly surprised by. So 94% said it helped build relationships across the organisation, which I kind of get, because if you think about, for those of you that use things like Facebook, showing my age now, it's like a kind of middle-aged woman, I love Facebook. When it first came out, I started using it right at the beginning of 2007, and I just moved to a new part of England, and I definitely used Facebook to help with my relationships, because I moved away from lots of friends and family. So it kind of makes sense that people could use ESNs in a similar way inside an organisation, but I was very surprised by these results. 86% said helping to locate knowledge, connect with like-minded people, those sorts of things. 85% feel part of a community or group, and 83% said helped build my network. So really good results there. Just give you a flavour of how people are rating their experience. A very positive experience in using these kinds of technologies. Again, there is a user bias in there, because the kinds of people that would use these technologies are probably more au fait, comfortable with technologies. There's a lot more work to be done here, but I think initial findings are really, really interesting. So moving on to the next slide. we wanted to look at the relationship between employees and work. So I'll just skip forward to the next slide. We wanted to actually study whether using ESN impacted engagement and well-being, and we have some really interesting preliminary results in from this. So if we just flick forward to the next slide, that would be great, thank you. So again, I won't go into all the science behind this, but we use kind of scales that are what we call in psychology reliable and valid. So we did just come up with some questions that we thought would be quite nice to ask. We've used some scales that we know measure things like work engagement, they measure things like vigour at work, it's very psychological, well-being at work. And you'll see from this that initially it looks as though people who use ESN are scoring more positively than people that don't use ESN. And some of those, you know, have got bigger differentials than others. So proud to tell others where I work, you know, those people that use ESN, 85%, those that don't, 10 percentage points under 75%. So what we don't know from this study is causality. So we don't know if it's using ESN causes people to feel like this, or there's other stuff going on. I would imagine there's other stuff going on, but what we do know is that there is some sort of link between people who use ESN and how they are engaged at work, or how engaged they feel at work. There's a definite positive difference for those using these tools and those that aren't using these tools, and we need to kind of explore why that is, and that's going to be kind of stage 2 of the research to find out which way the causal relationship goes. So moving on to the next slide. We also asked about well-being at work, which, as I said, is kind of what psychologists call, well, they talk about well-being, we would talk about happiness. Overall, we found that ESN users have high levels of well-being compared to those who don't use ESN. So again, some quite big differences here, actually. Again, these are sort of questions that come from reliable, valid, tested scales in psychology. So things like, you know, feel capable of making decisions, 92% versus 77%. That's a big difference. There's something going on there we need to go and further explore. ESN users are more likely to feel they can overcome difficulties, 87 versus 69%. Less likely to think of themselves as worthless, 96 versus 85, and are more likely to feel happy at work, 87 versus 80. So there's something going on here. We don't really know what it is yet, but we know there's a difference. So these technologies are definitely have some kind of role to play in all of this. What that is yet, we don't know. So just moving on to the next slide then. So in a nutshell, what we found, I think overall, you know, obviously you can kind of read the bullets for yourself, but overall we found that people using ESNs with the kind of 100 or so companies that we talked to were definitely having a better experience at work. They had high levels of well-being, they had high levels of engagement, on a whole range of scales that we use. We actually use some other scales from psychology around what's called the general health scale. So the health was better in terms of mental well-being and physical health, all sorts of things going on. And they're motivated differently. So we looked at motivation scales as well, which I haven't gone into here. They're motivated differently and have high levels of well-being. So what I think this research was really telling us is that there is definitely more work to be done to understand the role that these technologies play in making work a better experience for people. So really interesting. I have been umming and ahhing about how we take this further forwards. At one point I was thinking about using this as kind of my PhD research. I don't think that's going to happen now because I'm busy with clients, but we will be kind of delving into this a little bit more probably towards the end of this year, beginning of next year. So if you want to be involved, get in touch. We'd love to have more people involved. We're doing a lot more qualitative research and a lot more in-company research. So finding companies who have ESNs and within that organisation, comparing within an organisation, those people using ESN, those who are not using ESN, because that kind of eliminates a lot of the biases I've talked about here. So a lot of the stuff for those people in an organisation will be the same. The difference is more likely to be I'm using it, I'm not using it, and then we'll see kind of what's going on. So hopefully you found that helpful, interesting, and I'm hoping that you've got some questions for me. So over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Emma. That was really, really good, and you know we've certainly got a few questions coming in. So I'll let you just have a little drink, and then we'll take those questions. I think from the most liked ones are probably the best place to start. So the first one here is how do you get employees to adopt to an app?
Great question. So I cut my teeth when I first started in the corporate world. I started life as an academic, as a lecturer in psychology, and then I fell into the corporate world in '98. And my first role was comms and engagement manager at Seaboard that became EDF Energy. And one of my first jobs was to implement an intranet. And I don't think actually that whole kind of experience of getting people to adopt new technology has really changed since then. So my background is actually a behavioural change psychologist, and for me it's about taking people on a journey. So it's sort of saying, you know, do you know what it is? Have you heard of it? Do you understand it? And that's the kind of the rational piece. And then it's about sort of saying, okay, so the buy-in bit. So do you understand what it could do for you, how it could help you? And sharing stories, role models, those sorts of things. So I think it's interesting because the kind of world of adoption when it comes to technology, there's a lot of sort of change managers involved there, and lots of people who've got amazing technical skills, but a lot less psychology and psychologists. So for me, it comes down to those principles. It doesn't matter whether you're getting people to, I don't know, practice, you know, to take up healthy eating habits, or whether you're trying to get them to use new technology. The psychology is still the same. So it's really about taking people on that journey. We call it the engagement curve, taking people on the journey of really understanding what's in it for me, how can it help me, and of course everything's slightly different in that, you know, there may be kind of reasons for not adopting it. It might be I don't understand it and I'm scared of it, or I haven't got time. But you kind of, you know, it's really about finding out what those kind of barriers to entry are, and really overcoming those. But most people go on the same sort of journey when it comes to behavioural change, whether it's, you know, thinking about I don't know, selling a new product versus adopting a new technology. So hopefully that helps. Sorry, I feel like it's a bit waffly really. I can give you more background on that. I've got a whole load of stuff on that, papers and case studies on how to kind of really facilitate that behaviour change.
Great, and I've shared your details in the chat board as well, so people can follow up with you directly on that stuff. Another one that shot to the top here is, how do you police an engagement app if things get heated in conversations, collaboration on projects? Can you or should you hide comments?
It's a really good question. So we've actually got a tool that looks at organisational readiness for these types of technologies, because I think organisations are often in different places when it comes to these sorts of technologies, in terms of the way that they behave, you know, what's socially acceptable, what the social norms are. I'll tell you a very, very quick story. So years ago when I was at EDF, when we merged a few companies, I was kind of looking after comms engagement at the time, and on the London Electricity intranet, they had this kind of just forum where anybody could go on and ask anything about anything. And this was like the early 2000s. So we didn't know about apps back then. It was just, you know, a sort of a tool on the intranet. And of course, it was being completely abused. And there was one member of my team whose full-time job it was just to look after, manage, shut down questions, etc. on this app. And we sort of talked about it as a team. So it was a really cool feature. We don't want to take it away because it's like a really cool thing. We could see the potential of this, but we just felt the organisation wasn't ready to use it in an adult way. That, you know, for a whole host of reasons we won't go into today in terms of cultures and cultural readiness, etc. So we took this app, wasn't an app, sorry, we took this feature of the intranet and we renamed it Think Tank. And we said, we're going to have a think tank once a month, and it's going to be a moderated conversation online about a topic. And you can come up with a topic, or we'll come up with a topic, but it will be moderated. It'll be over a day or 2 days, and we'll get subject matter expert to sit behind the scenes and help to moderate it depending on what we're talking about. And it was a massive success. I mean, you know, if I'd only known then what we were on to, I would probably be a millionaire by now, but I didn't appreciate it because this was literally 2002, 2003. So we launched Think Tank, worked amazingly well because it was the culture of the organisation was ready for that kind of facilitated, moderated conversation. There wasn't enough of an adult-to-adult culture where people were respectful enough to not kind of have that really heated discussion and debate. So I think first of all, it's about kind of what sort of where is your culture at as an organisation in terms of what sorts of conversations are people ready to have, and it's a harsh thing to say, but actually if you go out with something that the organisation is just not ready for, then there is that opportunity for people to abuse it, and then, you know, senior people get involved and then shut it down. It's kind of, you know, gone before it's even started. When it comes to, you know, something that's already out there, it could be just about thinking about using it in a different way, having something more moderated, having something that works better for the organisation, the way I've just talked about. I think there's always sort of the in terms of shutting things down, switching things off. I think there's that sort of common sense approach around whether it starts to become, abusive to other people, goes against kind of code of ethic guidelines that you might have in the organisation where it's abusive, people are not being treated respectfully. Are people behaving in line with your values? Most values have something in there about kind of how we are expected to behave at work in terms of respect and those sorts of behaviours. So I'd say have a look at those if you can align it with that. But in an ideal world, freedom of speech is a wonderful thing, but in an organisation, things can kind of get very heated very quickly. Suddenly you've got disciplinaries involved, and then you've got code of how to use your question forum board, and so it loses the purpose that it had initially. Hopefully that's helped.
Absolutely, thanks. We're just getting to what usually would be the end of the time, but we've got quite a few good questions here. So if Emma's okay, we'll keep going, and those of you that are happy to stay on, that would be great. So one about anonymity here. So we said, like the anonymity on here, can ESNs and other tools be anonymous?
Yeah, I mean that's really up to how you set it up. I mean, I'm not the hugest expert. I mean, I've worked with companies to help them implement things like Yammer, Jive, Workplace, etc., bespoke, and there are often conversations about anonymity. And again, it really comes down to cultural readiness. And for me, I always come back to what's the purpose? What are we trying to achieve here? And if the purpose is to help create collaboration, etc., then anonymity is probably not a good thing. But if the purpose is to give people a voice, and they're more likely to give a voice if they're anonymous, then it's a good thing. So I'd always say come back to what's the purpose, what are you trying to achieve to really answer that question.
Great stuff, thanks. And then one here that says, why do you think it's taken so long for companies to start using apps for engagement, considering smartphones have been around for so long?
Really good question. And it's something that I don't know. The short answer is I don't know, but I could sort of speculate. I think it's a brilliant question. It's something that, that's kind of part of the reason we did the research, because, these technologies, apps, etc., took off massively outside of work. And inside work, we're still using like really clunky old intranets and email. And, most of us are kind of on WhatsApp groups and, similar, with our friends, most people don't really use email outside of work anymore. This is something official that you've got to do, and yet we're not making best use of these technologies inside of work. And I think part of it is there's this fear of loss of control. Everybody will be just faffing around and playing. People won't be doing work. So those companies that have adopted it have had a really clear purpose and understood the potential of these technologies to really help collaboration, except all things I've talked about before. But there are a lot of companies who still feel that if you're on your phone, you're not working, or if you're on an app, you're not working. So I think that could be a barrier to entry. But it's a really good question. I think it's probably a good question for us to ask in the next research round that we do in terms of why companies are not adopting them. There's also cost as well. So the cost is prohibitive, I think, for a lot of companies, because the software as a service model, works really well up to a certain number of employees. But if you've got over, say, around 5,000 employees or 10,000 employees, and you're paying per user, suddenly it's like, well, we can't afford that. That's like hundreds of thousands of pounds a year. So it can look like a really kind of, cheap, inexpensive tool, and then, the software as a service model is quite prohibitive, which I think is starting to change as well. So, but I think it's a great question, and something I'd definitely like to look into further.
Brilliant, and hopefully you'll come and talk to us about the results of it. There's one here that hasn't got as many likes, but I really want to know the answer to it, actually. It's, do you think the data results shown on ESNs can have parallels drawn with other engagement tech?
Yeah. 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 It was, I've been talking about doing this research for absolutely years, because I was really interested into why aren't companies using this stuff. It's it's great, surely it can help. I'm also fascinated by, as a kind of a positive psychologist, I'm fascinated by the social media outside of an organisation, how it impacts our well-being, and the way emotions are transferred really quickly via Facebook. So if it rains in a city in Facebook and everyone's moaning about it, that impacts kind of emotional the emotional contagion, either the emotions spread really quickly, that impacts people's Facebook status updates within about 500-mile radius or something. So I've been very interested in that. In terms of other technologies, there's so much out there now. When we did this research, it's about 18 months ago, but I've been planning it for a good few years. It was a bit simpler just to kind of look at enterprise social networks. And now I think our job's been made a bit harder because there are all these different tools and they're all quite different. So I think we'd need to have a look at how these different tools are used. There's a huge piece of research in here. Are some tools better than others? But I think ultimately, anything that can connect people, that can make their jobs easier, that can make them feel they've got a voice, can make them feel they can collaborate easy, has got to be a good thing in an organisation, whether that's an app like Me Too, whether it's an enterprise social network like Yammer or Jive, whatever it might be. I think it's got to be a good thing.
Good stuff, thanks. And just obviously we talked about the ESNs quite a lot. Somebody's asked, what qualifies as an ESN and what are the best tools? So
in the research, I need to look at it actually. We did state what we felt an ESN was. So it very much was about an enterprise social network. So it was less, not saying it wasn't an app because there can be app versions, but it was a little bit, it was basically social media inside an organisation. So anything that allowed people to have social interactions inside an organisation. So things like, Yammer, Jive, Workplace by Facebook. There were others as well. I think they're changing so quickly. But I guess part of the challenge is that definition is a lot more woolly already, even sort of 18 months after we've finished the research, probably 2 years since sort of talking about it, planning it. So I think we'd have to go back and revisit that definition and look more widely at kind of what technologies are in an organisation that can help people to have different, better experiences. And I guess one of the big things is, an intranet in its traditional sense is a lot more one way. It's a lot more, I go on, there's stuff posted on there, and I access it a bit more like it's a website, if you like. Whereas an ESN is much more like, the experience you would have from using something like Facebook or Instagram, in that it's collaborative and I can talk to different people and I can express sentiment on different things and I can interact with people and collaborate with people. So but it's a good question. I think there's no kind of hard and fast way to define it.
Great stuff. Okay, I think we're probably well over time. If any more questions come in, hopefully, Emma, you won't mind if we get you to answer them and we can communicate them to everybody that attended today.
Absolutely, yeah. Happy to continue the conversation. That'd be great.
Brilliant, thank you. And just to remind everybody now, I've turned on a survey in the app, so hopefully you can give us some feedback on the webinar before you all go. Well, I think certainly, we've overrun because of lots of questions. That's, always a great problem to have. So, Emma, thank you very much for co-hosting today, and we look forward to hearing on all the results of your next bit of research next year.
Yeah, no problem. And if anyone wants the copy of the research, just get in touch and we can get that over to you, no problem, for all the in-depth results.
Great stuff, and we'll share your details again on that board shortly.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks for everybody. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks very much. Bye-bye.